Sometimes the hardest truths hide behind the simplest lies. When Gideon Hale's Bentley crossed the rusted welcome sign into Millgate, Ohio, he felt like he was driving into his own grave. The town where he'd been born 47 years ago looked like it was dying, one boarded storefront at a time. Main Street stretched ahead like a mouth with missing teeth, gaps where prosperity used to smile back at him. He'd left this place with nothing but a scholarship and a promise to his dying mother that he'd make something of himself. Now he was worth more than the entire town's annual budget, but the weight of that money felt heavier than the grief he'd been carrying for 2 years, ever since Clarissa passed. Gideon parked behind Murphy's old garage, the same one where he'd pumped gas summers during high school. The building looked like it was held together by rust and stubbornness, but the "For Rent" sign in the window was exactly what he'd been hoping to find. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He needed a place to disappear, to become someone else for a while, someone his own daughter wouldn't recognize. The plan had been forming in his mind for months, ever since Lena's 26th birthday party. He'd thrown her the kind of celebration that made headlines in society magazines, complete with celebrity guests and a champagne fountain that cost more than most people's cars. But when he'd found her later that night, sitting alone on the terrace of their penthouse, tears streaming down her face, he'd realized that all his money couldn't buy what she really needed. "I don't know who I really am, Dad," she'd whispered, and those words had been echoing in his head ever since. Because the truth was, he didn't know who she really was either. 26 years of nannies and boarding schools and trust funds had created a beautiful, intelligent stranger who called him father but looked at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve. The garage owner turned out to be Murphy's grandson, a tired-looking man in his 50s who didn't seem to recognize Gideon's face from the business magazines. The rent was cheap enough to pay in cash for 6 months up front, no questions asked. Within an hour, Gideon had the keys to his new identity. He'd practiced the story in his head during the drive from Chicago. Gideon Hayes, laid-off factory worker from Toledo. Divorced, estranged from his family, looking for a fresh start in a quiet town. He'd even bought clothes from Walmart, letting the designer suits hang in his closet back home like abandoned dreams. The cottage he rented on Elm Street was small enough that he could touch both walls of the kitchen with his arms outstretched. The furniture was old but clean, the kind of practical pieces that had seen decades of honest living. For the first time in years, Gideon found himself thinking about his childhood, about Saturday mornings helping his father fix the neighbor's lawnmower for $5 and a plate of Mrs. Henderson's chocolate chip cookies. That evening, he walked downtown to the Main Street Diner, the only place in town that still had lights on after 8 o'clock. The woman behind the counter had silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and the kind of sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything that walked through her door. "You're new," she said. It wasn't a question. "Gideon Hayes," he replied, settling onto one of the red vinyl stools. "Just moved into the cottage on Elm." "Tilda Avery," she said, pouring him coffee without asking if he wanted any. "Town clerk, unofficial welcome committee, and keeper of everybody's business, whether they want me to keep it or not." The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and Gideon found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Heard you might have work around here." "I'm good with my hands. Used to fix cars back in Toledo." Tilda studied him over the rim of her own coffee cup. Something in her expression suggested she was filing away details for later consideration, but all she said was, "Murphy's grandson might could use help at the garage. Town's not much to look at anymore, but folks still need their cars fixed." That night, alone in the cottage, Gideon made the phone call he'd been rehearsing for weeks. His assistant Marcus had been with the company for 8 years, long enough to know when not to ask questions about unusual requests. "I need you to set up a profile on that matchmaking app Lena uses," Gideon said. "Executive connections, high-end stuff." "Sir?" Marcus's voice carried the careful tone of someone trying not to judge their boss's apparent midlife crisis. "Tell her it's a social experiment. Part of a series about authentic human connection in the digital age. She'll eat that up, you know how she is about trends." Gideon stared out the cottage window at the empty street. "Set her up with someone local. Someone real." He'd already identified the perfect candidate. Micah Rivers, 28, worked at the diner and had the kind of easy smile that suggested he'd never had to worry about whether people liked him for his money. According to the background check Gideon had quietly run, Micah had given up a journalism degree to take care of his disabled younger brother after their parents died in a car accident. The kind of sacrifice Gideon respected, even if he'd never been capable of making it himself. "When do you want this to happen?" Marcus asked. "Next weekend. Tell her to come to Millgate. It's a small town in Ohio, about 3 hours from Chicago. Tell her it's part of the experiment, meeting someone outside her usual social circle." After he hung up, Gideon sat in the silence of his temporary home and wondered if he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But Clarissa's voice whispered in his memory, the same words she'd said to him on their first date 28 years ago. "You can't know someone's heart until you've seen how they treat people who can't do anything for them." He was about to find out what kind of heart his daughter really had. Lena Hale stepped out of her Tesla Model S and immediately regretted wearing Louboutin heels to a town that looked like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Main Street stretched before her like a movie set for a film about economic decline, complete with boarded windows and weeds growing through sidewalk cracks. Her phone showed 1 bar of signal, and she couldn't find a single coffee shop that looked like it would know what oat milk was. "This is supposed to be character building," she muttered, checking her reflection in the car window. The dating consultant Marcus had recommended swore that stepping outside your comfort zone was the key to finding authentic connection. Lena had been skeptical, but the algorithm had matched her with someone who scored surprisingly high on compatibility metrics, despite living in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. The Main Street diner looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s, all red vinyl and chrome that had seen better decades. Through the window, she could see a handful of locals nursing coffee and giving her car the kind of looks usually reserved for UFO sightings. She'd deliberately dressed down for this date. Jeans and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than most people in this town made in a month, but it was the most casual thing she owned. The man behind the counter had to be Micah Rivers. The photos on his profile hadn't done justice to the way he moved. Easy and confident in a way that suggested he'd never questioned whether he belonged in his own skin. He was wiping down tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing restaurant work long enough to make it look effortless. "You must be Lena," he said, looking up with a smile that was equal parts welcoming and amused. "I was starting to think you'd gotten lost." "Just appreciating the local charm," she said, glancing around at the peeling wallpaper and mismatched chairs. "This place has a lot of character." "That's one way to put it." Micah hung up his apron and gestured toward a booth by the window. "Fair warning, the coffee's strong enough to wake the dead, and the pie's better than it has any right to be considering Mrs. Patterson's been making it the same way since the Carter administration." They slid into opposite sides of the booth, and Lena found herself studying his hands as he poured coffee from a pot that looked older than she was. They were working hands, scarred and calloused in a way that suggested he'd never had the luxury of avoiding physical labor. So different from the soft, manicured fingers of the men she usually dated. "So," Micah said, settling back in his seat with the kind of relaxed confidence that immediately put her on edge, "what brings a city girl to our thriving metropolis of Millgate?" The question was casual enough, but something in his tone suggested he'd already formed opinions about who she was and why she was here. Lena had spent enough time in boardrooms to recognize when someone was testing her. "The same thing that brings anyone anywhere these days," she said. "Curiosity. Boredom. The app promised I'd meet someone who wasn't just another corporate clone in a $1,000 suit. And how's that working out for you so far?" Lena looked around the diner again, taking in the worn linoleum and the elderly man in the corner booth who kept glancing over at them with undisguised interest. "Jury's still out." Micah laughed, and the sound was genuine enough to make her defensive posture soften slightly. "Fair enough. Though I have to say, you're not exactly what I was expecting either." "What were you expecting?" "Someone a little less." He paused, searching for the right words while his gaze took in her perfectly styled hair and designer jeans. "Polished. The app said you were interested in authentic experiences and meaningful connections, but you look like you stepped out of a magazine spread about slumming it in small-town America." Heat rose in Lena's cheeks. She'd spent 26 years having people make assumptions about her based on her appearance, her father's money, her address. She'd hoped that coming here, meeting someone who didn't know her history, might be different. "Maybe authentic experiences aren't always about looking the part," she said, her voice cooler than she'd intended. "Maybe sometimes they're about being willing to show up somewhere new and see what happens." Maybe Micah agreed, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. So what do you do when you're not traveling to small towns for social experiments? The question was loaded with enough skepticism to make Lena's jaw tighten. She could tell him about her work with the foundation, about the literacy programs and community gardens she helped fund. But something in his attitude made her want to be contrary, to lean into whatever assumptions he'd already made. "I manage investments," she said. Which was technically true, even if it left out the part about inheriting more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. Portfolio diversification, market analysis, that kind of thing. "Sounds exciting," Micah said dryly. "Let me guess. You're here because your therapist told you to connect with your authentic self by experiencing how the other half lives?" The accuracy of the guess stung more than it should have. Lena had been seeing Dr. Morrison for 6 months, ever since the panic attack started. Ever since she'd woken up one morning in her penthouse apartment and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt genuinely happy about anything. "Something like that," she admitted. They were interrupted by the sound of a car backfiring outside, followed by colorful cursing that would have made her father's corporate lawyers blush. Through the window, Lena could see a man in coveralls wrestling with the hood of an ancient pickup truck. "Excuse me a second," Micah said, sliding out of the booth. "Gideon's having truck trouble again." Lena watched through the window as Micah jogged outside to help the man with the truck. They worked together with the easy familiarity of neighbors who'd helped each other through countless small crises. The man, Gideon apparently, was older, maybe late 40s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd spent most of his life working outdoors. When they got the truck running, both men looked pleased in the way that came from solving a practical problem with their own hands. Gideon said something that made Micah laugh, clapping him on the shoulder before climbing back into his truck and driving away with a grateful wave. Micah returned to the booth looking slightly more relaxed, as if the brief mechanical crisis had reminded him why he liked his life here. "Sorry about that." Gideon's new in town, still figuring out which garage will actually fix his truck, instead of just taking his money. "Seems like you know everyone around here," Lena said. "It's that kind of place. Population small enough that everybody's business becomes everybody's business, whether you want it to or not." Micah studied her face for a moment. "Must be different where you come from." "Very different," Lena agreed, thinking about her building in Chicago where she'd lived for 3 years without learning the doorman's name. Is it lonely? Living somewhere this small? The question seemed to catch Micah off guard. For the first time since she'd sat down, his easy confidence wavered slightly. "Sometimes," he said. "But lonely's not the same as alone. In a place like this you can't hide from people, even when you want to. That has its advantages." Something in his voice suggested he was thinking about specific people, specific losses. Lena found herself curious about the stories behind his careful words. "What made you stay?" she asked. "I mean, you must have thought about leaving. Most people our age do." "Family," Micah said simply. "Responsibility. The things that matter more than what you want for yourself." It was the kind of answer that made Lena feel small and selfish, but also curious. She'd spent most of her adult life surrounded by people whose biggest responsibility was deciding which charity gala to attend. The idea of staying somewhere you didn't necessarily want to be for someone else's sake was as foreign to her as the diner's ancient cash register. "That sounds lonely in its own way," she said. Probably cost more than he was charging for the brake job, but she looked more relaxed than he'd seen her in years. "Morning, Gideon," Micah called out. "Thought you might want some real coffee instead of whatever you're making in that garage." "Much obliged," Gideon said, wiping his hands on a rag and accepting the cup. The simple kindness of the gesture reminded him why he'd always liked small towns, even as a kid who couldn't wait to escape this one. "Lena, this is Gideon Hayes," Micah said. "Best mechanic in town now that Murphy's grandson retired." "Gideon, this is Lena. She's visiting from Chicago." "Chicago," Gideon repeated as if hearing the name of his own city for the first time. Up close, Lena looked tired but curious, the way she used to look as a child when she'd discovered something new in the garden behind their old house. "Small world," Lena said, extending her hand. "I don't think I've ever met a mechanic before." Her handshake was firm, but Gideon could feel the softness of palms that had never held tools or earned calluses. It broke his heart a little, remembering the girl who used to help him change oil in their driveway back when she was 8 years old and still thought her father could fix anything. Well, we're not exactly exotic creatures, he said, releasing her hand before she could notice the slight tremor in his own. Though I suppose in Chicago you probably just push a button on your phone when your car needs attention. Something like that, Lena said with a small smile. Though I have to admit, there's something satisfying about watching someone actually fix something instead of just replacing it. Most things worth having are worth fixing, Gideon said, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded too much like something a father might say to his daughter, too loaded with meaning for a casual introduction. Micah was telling Lena about his plan to show her the old quarry on the edge of town, the swimming hole where half of Millgate had learned to dive during the summers when the town still had enough young people to make noise. As they walked away, Lena looked back over her shoulder at Gideon, and for a moment he thought he saw recognition flicker across her face. But then Micah said something that made her laugh, and the moment passed. That afternoon, while Lena and Micah were hiking through the woods behind the quarry, Gideon found himself thinking about the environmental impact reports he'd seen years ago, back when his company had first considered expanding into the Midwest. There had been mentions of contamination around Millgate, old chemical dumps from the factories that used to drive the local economy. At the time, he'd been focused on server farms and data centers, not small-town cleanup efforts. But now he wondered what else he'd overlooked in his rush to build an empire. The thought was still nagging at him when Tilda Avery appeared in the garage doorway, carrying a plate of cookies that smelled like they'd been cooling on a windowsill somewhere. "Thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the plate on his workbench. "Mrs. Chen made extra." Gideon accepted the offering gratefully, but he could tell from Tilda's expression that charity wasn't the real reason for her visit. She had the look of someone who'd been collecting information and was ready to start asking questions about what it all meant. "That's a nice watch," she said, nodding toward his wrist. "Expensive looking, for a laid-off factory worker." Gideon looked down at the Rolex he'd forgotten to take off, a gift from Clarissa on their 10th anniversary. In his careful construction of a new identity, he'd overlooked the small details that would give him away to someone who knew how to look. "Inheritance," he said, which was technically true. "My grandfather's, only valuable thing my family ever owned." Tilda studied his face with the same careful attention she'd probably given 40 years, worth of tax assessments and permit applications. "Funny thing about inheritances, sometimes they're more complicated than they appear." "Sometimes," Gideon agreed. "That young lady from Chicago," Tilda continued, settling herself on a crate like she planned to stay a while. "Pretty girl. Smart too, from what I can tell. Asking a lot of questions about the town's history. Natural curiosity, I suppose." "Maybe." Tilda picked up a wrench from the workbench and turned it over in her hands, the way someone might examine evidence. "Though it's interesting, the timing of things. New mechanic in town. City girl shows up asking questions. Young Micah suddenly interested in old records from the library basement." Gideon felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd planned for Lena to be charmed by small-town simplicity, maybe learn something about authenticity and genuine human connection. He hadn't planned for her to start investigating the town's secrets, or for those secrets to lead back to his own corporate history. "People get curious about new places," he said carefully. "Indeed they do," Tilda agreed. "Question is, what happens when they start finding answers they weren't looking for?" After she left, Gideon called Marcus from the garage's ancient landline, keeping his voice low even though he was alone. "I need you to pull all the records on our Midwest operations from 2010 to 2015, he said. "Environmental impact studies, contract proposals, anything related to Millgate or the surrounding area." "Sir, is there a problem?" Gideon looked out the garage door at the quiet street, at the boarded storefronts and the weeds growing through sidewalk cracks. He was starting to understand that the problems in Millgate weren't just about economic decline. They were about the kind of damage that took decades to accumulate and even longer to heal. "I'm not sure yet," he said, "but I think there might be." That night he dreamed of Clarissa again. This time they were walking through the woods behind the quarry, the same path Lena and Micah had taken that afternoon. The trees were fuller in the dream, green and healthy, the way they might have looked before the chemicals seeped into the groundwater. "She's stronger than you think," Clarissa said, taking his hand as they walked. "But strength doesn't mean she won't break if you keep pushing." "I just want her to be happy," Gideon said. "No, you want her to be who you think she should be. There's a difference." When he woke this time, the cottage felt smaller than ever. Outside his window, Millgate slept quietly under a canopy of stars, keeping its secrets buried beneath decades of good intentions and corporate progress reports. But Gideon was starting to understand that some secrets had a way of finding their way to the surface, especially when someone like his daughter started digging for truth. He made coffee in the dark and sat at the kitchen table, watching the empty street and wondering if it was too late to call the whole thing off, but he knew it was. The moment Lena had shaken Micah's hand in the diner, the moment she'd looked at him with genuine curiosity instead of polite boredom, the experiment had taken on a life of its own. All he could do now was hope that when the truth finally came out, there would still be something left worth saving. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The power had been out at the Henderson farm for 3 days when Micah got the call. Old Pete Henderson was too proud to ask for help directly, but his daughter in Columbus had called the diner in a panic after he'd mentioned something about trying to fix the electrical problem himself. At 78, Pete had more stubbornness than good sense, and everyone in town knew it. "Want to come along?" Micah asked Lena over breakfast at the diner. "It's not exactly a tourist attraction, but you said you wanted to see how people really live around here." Lena looked up from her scrambled eggs, considering. She'd been in Millgate for 4 days now, longer than she'd planned to stay anywhere outside Chicago in years. But something about the rhythm of small-town life was settling into her bones in unexpected ways. The way Mrs. Patterson remembered how she liked her coffee. The way people nodded to her on the street like she belonged there. "Sure," she said. "Though I should warn you, my experience with electrical problems pretty much begins and ends with calling a maintenance service." "That's okay. I have a feeling you're better with your hands than you think." The Henderson farm sat on 40 acres of rolling hills about 10 minutes outside town. Pete met them at the front gate, a weathered man in coveralls who looked like he'd been carved from the same oak trees that dotted his property. His handshake was firm enough to crack knuckles, and his eyes held the kind of clarity that came from 78 years of solving his own problems. "Appreciate you coming out," he said to Micah, then turned to Lena with polite curiosity. "Don't believe we've met, miss." "Lena Hale," she said, extending her hand. "I'm visiting from Chicago." "City girl, huh?" Pete's smile was kind but knowing. "Well, hope you don't mind getting a little dirty. This ain't gonna be pretty work." The electrical panel in Pete's basement looked like it had been installed sometime during the Eisenhower administration. Wires snaked in all directions, some wrapped in electrical tape that had seen better decades. The whole setup would have given a professional electrician nightmares, but Pete had been maintaining it himself for 40 years with the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be learned from books. "Main breaker's been trippin'," Pete explained, shining a flashlight into the tangle of wires. "Tried to trace it myself, but these old eyes ain't what they used to be." Micah rolled up his sleeves and dove into the maze of circuits with the confidence of someone who'd learned to troubleshoot by necessity rather than training. Lena watched him work, noting the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency. The way he explained what he was doing without talking down to Pete, or making him feel foolish for attempting the repair himself. "Hand me that voltage tester," Micah said, nodding toward a tool on Pete's workbench. Lena picked up the device, surprised by how natural it felt in her hands. She'd never been allowed to touch tools growing up. Her father had hired professionals for everything, from changing light bulbs to hanging pictures. But something about the weight of the tester, the purposeful design of it, felt right. "You can help," Micah said, looking up from the panel. "I need someone to hold the flashlight while I check these connections." For the next 2 hours, Lena found herself acting as Micah's assistant, holding lights and tools, learning the difference between hot wires and neutral ones, understanding for the first time how electricity flowed through the hidden arteries of a building. Her hands got dirty, her sweater got snagged on a rough beam, and she felt more useful than she had in months of foundation board meetings and charity galas. "There," Micah said finally, flipping the main breaker back on. The basement fluorescent lights flickered to life, humming with the sound of reliable power restored. "Should hold you for another few years, Pete. But you might want to start thinking about updating this panel eventually." Eventually, Pete agreed with the tone of someone who'd been putting off eventually for decades. "Can't thank you enough, son, both of you." He insisted they stay for dinner, and Lena found herself sitting at a kitchen table that had probably hosted 70 years of family meals, eating pot roast that had been simmering all day in a slow cooker. Pete told stories about the farm, about the changes he'd seen in Millgate over the decades, about the factories that used to employ half the county, and the young people who used to stick around to raise their own families. "Town's not what it was," he said, passing around homemade bread that his late wife's recipe had perfected decades ago, "but it's still got good bones. Still got people who look out for each other." As they drove back to town in Micah's pickup truck, Lena found herself thinking about the satisfaction she'd felt holding that flashlight, being part of something that actually fixed a real problem for someone who needed help. It was different from writing checks to charities, different from attending fundraising dinners, where the problems being discussed felt abstract and distant. "Thank you for letting me help," she said. "Thank you for actually helping," Micah replied. A lot of people would have sat in the truck and scrolled through their phones. "Is that what you expected me to do?" Micah was quiet for a moment, considering. "At first, maybe, but you keep surprising me." They were passing through the town square when Lena noticed something that made her ask Micah to stop the truck. The old Carnegie Library sat on the corner like a monument to better times, its stone facade still grand despite the weeds growing through the front steps. But it was the sign in the window that caught her attention: Millgate Public Library, closed due to funding shortfall. "How long has it been closed?" she asked. "About 6 months. Town council couldn't afford to keep it running after the tax base shrunk." Micah's voice carried the resigned tone of someone who'd watched too many important things disappear. "Mrs. Garrett, the librarian, she's been trying to keep some services going out of her own house, but it's not the same." Lena stared at the empty building, thinking about the foundation board meetings she'd sat through, listening to presentations about literacy programs in developing countries while a library in small-town Ohio couldn't afford to stay open. The irony was sharp enough to cut. "Mind if we take a look inside?" she asked. "Library's locked up, but Mrs. Garrett lives just around the corner. She might be willing to show you around." Mrs. Garrett turned out to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of fierce intelligence that seemed to burn brighter when discussing books and learning. She was delighted to have visitors interested in the library's fate, and within minutes they were standing in the main reading room, surrounded by thousands of volumes that hadn't been checked out in months. "The building's sound," Mrs. Garrett explained, running her hand along one of the oak reading tables. "It just needs operating funds. Heat, electricity, someone to staff the circulation desk. The town council estimates it would take about $40,000 a year to keep basic services running." $40,000. Lena spent more than that on handbags in a typical year. The absurdity of it was almost laughable, except that it wasn't funny at all. It was heartbreaking. "What about grants?" she asked. "Federal funding? State programs?" "We've applied for everything we qualify for," Mrs. Garrett said. "But small towns like ours aren't exactly priorities these days. The money goes to bigger cities, places with more political influence." As they walked through the stacks, Lena found herself thinking about the children in Millgate who were growing up without access to books, without a quiet place to do homework, without the kind of resources she'd taken for granted her entire life. It felt personal in a way that surprised her. "I might know some people who could help," she said carefully. "People with foundations, grant-making capabilities. Would you be interested in exploring some options?" Mrs. Garrett's eyes lit up with the kind of hope that had been tempered by too many disappointments. "Miss Hale, if you could help us find a way to reopen this library, this whole town would be in your debt." Later that evening, as they walked along Main Street toward the diner for coffee, Micah was unusually quiet. When Lena asked what he was thinking about, he stopped walking and turned to face her. "Are you sure you're just in investments?" he asked. "Because what you did back there, the way you talked to Mrs. Garrett, the questions you asked, that didn't sound like someone who just manages portfolios." Lena felt heat rise in her cheeks. The truth was complicated, bound up in trust funds and family foundations and the kind of wealth that made people treat her differently once they knew about it. But looking at Micah's face in the streetlight, she realized she was tired of being careful, tired of hiding behind partial truths. "It's complicated," she said. "Most interesting things are." Before she could lose her nerve, she reached for his hand. His fingers were still slightly rough from the electrical work, warm and solid and real. When he didn't pull away, she felt something shift between them, a door opening that had been closed for longer than she cared to admit. "I want to help," she said. with the library, with whatever else this town needs. But I need you to trust that my reasons are good, even if I can't explain everything right now." Micah studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read secrets written in the space between her words. Finally, he squeezed her hand. "Okay," he said. "But you should know that in a town this small, secrets have a way of finding their way to the surface eventually." As they stood there on the empty street, Lena found herself thinking about the electrical panel in Pete Henderson's basement, about the way problems could hide behind walls for years before someone finally had the courage to shine a light on them. She was beginning to understand that Millgate was full of hidden circuits, connections, and power flows that weren't immediately obvious to outsiders. She was also beginning to understand that she might be one of those problems, hidden behind the walls of her own carefully constructed identity. The question was whether Micah would still want to hold her hand when he finally saw all the wires. The Millgate Public Library's basement smelled like dust and old paper, with an undertone of mildew that spoke of decades of small leaks and deferred maintenance. Lena followed Mrs. Garrett down the narrow stairs, her phone's flashlight cutting through shadows that seemed thick enough to touch. Behind her, Micah carried a box of files that Mrs. Garrett had assembled over years of meticulous record-keeping. Most of the town's historical documents ended up down here when the courthouse renovated in the 1990s, Mrs. Garrett explained, navigating between towers of cardboard boxes with the confidence of someone who'd organized every inch of the chaos. Property records, tax assessments, development contracts. Nobody else wanted to store them, so the library became the unofficial town archive. They'd been researching for 3 hours, trying to trace the funding patterns that had led to the library's closure. What had started as a simple question about operating budgets had evolved into something more complex, a web of municipal contracts and development deals that painted a picture of systematic extraction rather than investment. "Here," Mrs. Garrett said, pulling out a thick folder marked Municipal Development, 2010 to 2015. "This is when things started changing. That's when the big companies started showing interest in our little corner of nowhere." Lena opened the folder and immediately recognized the corporate letterhead that dominated the first dozen pages. Eclipse Development Corporation. The name meant nothing to her, but the professional formatting and legal language were familiar from years of sitting through Foundation board meetings. Eclipse bought up half the commercial district during this period, Mrs. Garrett continued, promised to bring new businesses, create jobs, revitalize downtown. Instead, they let most of the buildings sit empty and used the properties for tax write-offs. Micah was reading over Lena's shoulder, his breath warm against her neck as they studied contract after contract. Each deal followed the same pattern. Eclipse would purchase distressed properties at below-market prices, take advantage of various tax incentives and development grants, then allow the buildings to deteriorate while maintaining just enough activity to qualify for ongoing municipal subsidies. "It's brilliant, in a horrible way," Micah said quietly. "They're making money by letting the town die slowly instead of killing it quickly." Lena turned the page and felt her blood freeze. At the bottom of a property transfer document, barely visible in small print, was a line that made her stomach clench. Eclipse Development Corporation, a wholly owned subsidiary of Hale Industries, LLC. Her father's company, her inheritance, her trust fund. She stared at the words until they blurred, trying to process the implications. Every empty storefront on Main Street, every closed business, every family that had packed up and moved away, it was all connected to the wealth that had funded her private schools and European vacations and Manhattan penthouse. "Lena," Micah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." She cleared her throat, trying to find words that wouldn't reveal too much, wouldn't shatter the fragile trust they'd been building. "I think I recognize this company name from some investment documents I've seen." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it felt like one. Mrs. Garrett was still pulling files from boxes, laying out a timeline of Millgate's decline that corresponded exactly with Eclipse Development's involvement in the town's economy. The pattern was clear once you knew how to look at it. Systematic asset stripping disguised as economic development. "The worst part," Mrs. Garrett said, opening another folder, "is that they had help from someone on the town council, someone who kept pushing these deals through even when other council members had questions." The name on the approval documents made Lena's heart sink even further. Thomas Brennan, listed as municipal development liaison, had signed off on every single Eclipse contract during the 5-year period. According to Mrs. Garrett, Brennan had left town shortly after the last deal was finalized, accepting a quote consulting position with a company nobody had ever heard of. Bought and paid for, Micah said grimly, and probably not the only one. They worked in increasingly tense silence for another hour, documenting the financial web that had slowly strangled Millgate's economy. With each new folder, each additional contract, the scope of the exploitation became clearer. Eclipse hadn't just bought properties. They'd systematically undermined the town's ability to attract legitimate businesses or maintain basic services. When Mrs. Garrett finally declared they'd found enough evidence to make some people very uncomfortable, Lena felt like she might throw up. The coffee she'd drunk earlier tasted bitter in her mouth, and her hands were shaking as she helped box up the documents they'd copied. "I need some air," she said, heading for the basement stairs before either of them could respond. Outside, the afternoon sun felt harsh after hours in the basement shadows. Lena sat on the library steps and tried to figure out how to tell Micah that she was complicit in everything they'd just discovered. That her trust fund was built on the ruins of his hometown. That her family's wealth had literally been extracted from the community he'd sacrificed his own dreams to serve. She was still trying to find the words when Tilda Avery's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Interesting reading material?" Lena looked up to find the town clerk standing at the bottom of the library steps, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who'd finally assembled enough puzzle pieces to see the complete picture. "Mrs. Avery," Lena said, trying to keep her voice steady, "we were just researching the library's funding situation." "I'm sure you were." Tilda climbed the steps slowly, settling herself beside Lena with the deliberate movements of someone who had important things to say. "Question is, what are you planning to do with what you found?" "I don't understand." "Oh, I think you understand perfectly, Miss Hale." Tilda's use of her last name hit like a physical blow. "Took me a while to place the name, but I've got a good memory for details. Especially when those details involve companies that have been bleeding my town dry for the better part of a decade." Lena's carefully constructed cover story crumbled like paper in rain. "How long have you known?" "Suspected from the beginning. Confirmed yesterday when I made some phone calls to people who keep track of such things." Tilda's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was steel underneath. "The question is, what are you doing here? And what does your father think he's accomplishing with his little masquerade?" "My father?" The words came out strangled. "Gideon Hayes, the mysterious mechanic who showed up in town right before you did? Honey, I may be old, but I'm not stupid. That man's got soft hands and expensive habits, and he watches you like a hawk every time you're in public together." Tilda leaned back against the library steps. "So I'll ask again, what are you both doing in my town?" Before Lena could attempt an answer, the library door opened and Micah emerged, carrying the box of copied documents. He took one look at their faces and immediately understood that something had shifted. "Problem?" he asked carefully. "You could say that," Tilda replied. "Turns out our visiting researcher here has some personal connections to the company that's been destroying Millgate piece by piece." Micah set down the box and looked at Lena with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What kind of connections?" Lena felt the weight of all her careful evasions, all the half-truths and strategic omissions she'd been using to protect herself from exactly this moment. The truth was sitting in her throat like a stone, too big to swallow, too sharp to speak. "Eclipse Development is owned by my family's company," she said finally. "The money that bought up half your town, the contracts that killed your economy, it all traces back to my inheritance." The silence that followed felt like falling. Micah stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language, while Tilda nodded with the grim satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "And your father?" Micah asked quietly. "The mechanic?" "Is Gideon Hale, CEO of Hale Industries." The words tasted like ashes. "He's been watching us." "Watching me? This whole thing was some kind of test." Micah picked up the box of documents and started walking away without another word. Lena scrambled to follow him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Wait," she called. "Let me explain." "Explain what?" Micah turned around, and for the first time since she'd known him, his face was completely closed off. "Explain how you've been lying to me from the moment we met. Explain how your family's money has been systematically destroying my town while you played tourist. Or maybe you want to explain how your father thought it would be fun to watch his daughter slum it with the locals. It's not like that, Lena said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Then what is it like? She opened her mouth to answer and realized she didn't know. The experiment, the blind date, her growing feelings for Micah, none of it made sense anymore. Everything she thought she'd been discovering about herself was contaminated by the lies she'd built her visit on. I need to go, Micah said, turning away again. I need to think. Lena watched him walk away, carrying evidence of her family's crimes in a cardboard box, and understood that she'd lost something precious before she'd even fully understood what she had. The afternoon sun felt cold on her face, and Millgate suddenly looked exactly like what it was, a place where she didn't belong, a community her money had helped destroy. Well, Tilda said, still sitting on the library steps like a witness to history, I'd say that went about as well as could be expected. Lena sank down beside her, fighting back tears that felt too little too late. What am I supposed to do now? Same thing anyone does when they find out they're on the wrong side of history, Tilda replied. Figure out how to get on the right side, if it's not already too late. Across the town square, Lena could see her father's garage, where the man she'd known as Gideon Hayes was probably working under the hood of someone's car, playing his role in whatever elaborate game he'd created. For the first time since arriving in Millgate, she felt angry at him instead of confused. Angry at the web of deception he'd wrapped around both of them. Angry at the damage his company had done in her name. But mostly she was angry at herself for believing that she could step outside her privilege long enough to find something real without reckoning with the ways her privilege had already shaped the world around her. The sun was setting behind the empty storefronts of Main Street, casting long shadows across a town that her family's money had helped hollow out. And somewhere in those shadows, the man she'd started to fall in love with was reading documents that proved everything she'd felt between them was built on a foundation of lies. The roadside inn sat 15 miles outside Millgate, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee, and anyone looking to disappear could rent a room by the week without questions. Lena had been there for 2 days, alternating between staring at the water-stained ceiling and walking the length of the parking lot like a caged animal. Her phone had 17 missed calls from her father and 43 unread text messages, but she couldn't bring herself to face his explanations or justifications or whatever elaborate reasoning he'd constructed for the mess they were both swimming in. The knock on her door came just after sunset on the second day. She opened it, expecting to find her father, but instead found Micah holding a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone who'd been wrestling with difficult decisions. "Can I come in?" he asked. Lena stepped back to let him enter, noting the way he took in the cheap furniture and industrial carpeting without comment. The room felt smaller with him in it, and she realized how much she'd missed his presence, even angry as he had every right to be. "I've been reading through the documents we found," he said, settling into the room's single chair while she perched on the edge of the bed. "Trying to understand the scope of what your family's company did to this town." "Micah, Let me finish." His voice was quiet but firm. "I spent the last 2 days being angry. Angry at you, angry at your father, angry at myself for not seeing through the whole charade. But then Noah reminded me of something." He opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of papers that looked different from the municipal contracts they'd been studying. These were personal documents, handwritten letters on expensive stationery. "These were in with your father's things at the garage." Tilda found them when she went to confront him about who he really was. Micah handed her the first letter. "I think they're from your mother." Lena recognized Clarissa's handwriting immediately. The careful script that had signed birthday cards and Christmas gifts and notes in her lunchbox during elementary school. The letter was dated 3 months before her mother's death. Addressed to "my darling daughter," in the formal way Clarissa had always written important things. "Lena, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone and your father has finally found the courage to share some truths that have been weighing on both our hearts. By now you may have learned things about our family's business that will be hard to reconcile with the life we've given you. I want you to know that I understand your anger, your confusion, even your sense of betrayal. When your father started his company, we were different people with different dreams. We wanted to build something that would make the world better, something that would give you and your children a foundation to do good. But success has a way of changing people, and money has a way of insulating us from the consequences of our choices. I've watched your father struggle with the weight of what his company has become, the distance between his intentions and the reality of corporate growth in an imperfect world. I've watched him try to protect you from that weight, to give you the innocence he feels he's lost. But innocence isn't the same as goodness, sweetheart. And protection isn't the same as love. Love without truth is a cage, even when that cage is built from the finest materials and decorated with the best intentions. Your father loves you more than his own life, but he's been afraid to trust you with the full weight of who you are and where you come from. I'm telling you this because I believe you're strong enough to carry that weight, strong enough to look at ugly truths and figure out how to make them beautiful, strong enough to take an inheritance that's complicated and messy and use it to build something better. The choice is yours, always. But whatever you choose it with your eyes wide open and your heart fully engaged. All my love, Mom. Lena read the letter twice before looking up to find Micah watching her with an expression that was careful and hopeful in equal measure. There are 6 more, he said quietly, all written during the last months of her illness, all trying to prepare you for conversations she knew your father wasn't ready to have. Lena opened the second letter, then the third, each one revealing more about her family's complex legacy. Clarissa had known about Eclipse development, about the small towns that had been sacrificed for quarterly profits and shareholder dividends. But she'd also known about the literacy programs and medical research and scholarship funds that bore the Hale name. The money was tainted, but it was also a tool that could be used for repair. The question isn't whether your inheritance is clean, Clarissa had written in the 5th letter. Nothing worth inheriting ever is. The question is what you'll do with the power it gives you, how you'll use it to heal some of the damage that was done in your name. Why didn't she give these to me herself? Lena asked, wiping tears she hadn't realized she was crying. According to your father, she tried. But you were so angry during those last months, so focused on medical treatments and experimental therapies. She said you weren't ready to hear what she needed to tell you. Lena remembered those final weeks with painful clarity. She'd been 24 and absolutely certain that money could solve anything, including her mother's cancer. She'd researched experimental treatments in Switzerland and Germany, had bullied doctors and specialists and insurance companies with the kind of entitled fury that came from never being told no about something that mattered. The idea that her mother might have important things to say beyond fighting the disease had seemed like giving up. I wasn't ready, she admitted. I thought if I could just find the right treatment, spend enough money, she'd get better and we'd have time for difficult conversations later. But there wasn't a later. No, there wasn't. The 6th letter was shorter than the others, written in handwriting that shook with medication and fatigue, but still carried Clarissa's distinctive voice. Sweetheart, your father is going to do something foolish after I'm gone. Something that feels like protection but is really about his own fear of losing you completely. When he does, try to remember that love makes us do crazy things, and grief makes those crazy things feel necessary. Forgive him if you can. But more importantly, forgive yourself for being human in an inhuman world. You are so much stronger than you know. Mom. The 7th and final letter was addressed to both Lena and Gideon, and contained specific instructions for accessing a trust fund that Clarissa had established independently of the family business. Money set aside specifically for repairing damage done in our name to communities we've harmed. She knew, Lena said, looking up at Micah. She knew about Millgate, about what Eclipse was doing. According to the documentation, she tried to get your father to divest from the subsidiary companies. When he wouldn't, she started setting aside money to eventually make things right. Why didn't she just do it herself? Because she was dying, and legal challenges to corporate structures take years to resolve. She needed someone younger, someone with the energy to fight those battles. Lena set down the last letter and looked around the cheap motel room that had become her temporary refuge from the complicated truths of her real life. So what now? Now you decide what kind of person you want to be. Micah leaned forward in his chair, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. You can go back to Chicago and pretend none of this happened. Collect your dividends and let other people worry about the damage. Or you can stay and figure out how to fix what your family broke. What if I don't know how to fix it? Then you learn, same as everyone else. For the first time in days, Lena felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The situation was still impossible, her relationship with her father still fractured, her feelings for Micah still complicated by weeks of lies, but her mother's voice was clear in her mind, urging her toward the kind of courage that required facing ugly truths instead of hiding from them. "There's something else," Micah said, pulling out his phone. "Noah's been working on a project using those drones he flies around the quarry. He found something buried in the woods behind the old chemical plant. Something your family's company might want to keep buried." He showed her aerial footage of what looked like unmarked burial sites in a stretch of forest that officially belonged to the state park system. But according to the property records Noah had cross-referenced, the land had been owned by Eclipse Development until just 3 years ago, when it had been quietly transferred to the state as part of an undisclosed legal settlement. "Environmental cleanup?" Lena asked, though she already knew the answer was more complicated than that. "Among other things. Noah thinks there might be documentation buried with whatever's out there. Evidence that your father's company knew about contamination years before they were legally required to disclose it." Lena stared at the drone footage until the pixels blurred together. Every answer they found seemed to generate 3 new questions, each more damning than the last. But underneath the guilt and confusion, she could feel something else growing. A determination to understand the full scope of what she'd inherited, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. "I need to talk to him," she said finally. "My father. I need to hear his side of all this." "Are you sure you're ready for that conversation?" Lena thought about her mother's letters, about the trust fund that had been waiting for her to be strong enough to use it, about the town full of people who deserved better than corporate excuses and legal settlements. "No," she said, "but I think that might be the point." Outside the motel window, the sun had set completely, leaving only the glow of neon signs and the distant lights of Millgate. Somewhere in that darkness, her father was probably sitting in his rented cottage, wondering if he'd lost his daughter forever in his attempt to understand who she really was. Tomorrow, she would find out if it was possible to build something real on a foundation of lies. Tonight, she would read her mother's letters one more time and try to find the courage to forgive the people she loved for being human in an inhuman world. The choice was hers, always, but for the first time since arriving in Millgate, she thought she might be strong enough to choose wisely. The Millgate Community Center buzzed with more energy than it had seen in decades. Every folding chair was occupied, with overflow crowds spilling into the hallway and onto the front steps. Word had spread through town with the efficiency that only happens when something truly matters is about to unfold. Lena stood backstage, her hands trembling as she reviewed her notes one final time. Through a crack in the curtain, she could see faces she'd come to know over the past weeks. Mrs. Patterson from the diner, Pete Henderson from the farm, Mrs. Chen with her gentle smile. These were people whose lives had been shaped by decisions made in boardrooms they'd never seen, by policies crafted by executives who'd never bothered to visit the communities they affected. "You ready for this?" Micah asked, appearing beside her with the kind of steady presence that had become her anchor through all the chaos of discovery and revelation. "No," she admitted, "but I think that's the point." Tilda Avery was calling the meeting to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been managing public crises for 40 years. The crowd settled into expectant silence, faces turned toward the small stage where a podium and projection screen had been set up. "We're here because some troubling information has come to light about our town's recent history," Tilda began. "Information that every resident has a right to understand." Lena walked to the podium on unsteady legs, looking out at the packed room. She could see recognition dawning on some faces. Word had gotten around about the mysterious visitor who'd been asking questions and digging through municipal records. "My name is Lena Hale," she began, her voice carrying clearly despite her nerves. "And I have a confession to make about why I'm really here." She clicked to her first slide, showing the Eclipse Development logo alongside incorporation documents. "My family's company has been systematically destroying your town for 15 years. I came here not knowing that, but I can't leave without telling you the truth." The room erupted in murmurs. Lena pushed forward, explaining the web of shell companies and tax schemes that had drained Millgate's resources while providing minimal investment in return. Each slide revealed another layer of exploitation. Properties bought cheap and left to rot. subsidies collected for non-existent development projects, tax breaks obtained through false promises of job creation. "Your town didn't die naturally," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It was killed deliberately by people who saw your community as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet." Mrs. Patterson stood up, her hands shaking with decades of suppressed anger. "My family ran a business on Main Street for 60 years. When Eclipse bought the building next door, they let it rot until the roof damaged our inventory. We had to close after 3 generations." Other voices joined in, sharing stories of forced closures and abandoned dreams. Each testimony was a thread in the larger tapestry of systematic destruction that Lena's inheritance was built on. "I want to help you fight this," she said when the personal stories had run their course, "even though it means fighting my own family's interests. Because what they did here was wrong, and I can't pretend otherwise." The applause started hesitantly, building as people processed what they'd heard. But then a familiar voice cut through the noise. "I think there are some things I need to say." Lena turned to see her father walking down the center aisle, still wearing the coveralls of his mechanic disguise but carrying himself with the bearing of a man ready to own his choices. "My name is Gideon Hale," he said, stopping beside the podium. "I'm the CEO of Hale Industries, and I'm responsible for what's been done to your community." The transformation from small-town nobody to corporate executive left the crowd speechless. Gideon looked directly at his daughter, and she saw something she'd been hoping to find for years: complete honesty without calculation or fear. "I came here to test my daughter," he continued, "to see if she could recognize authenticity, form real connections with people who didn't know her wealth. I thought I was conducting an experiment in human nature." His voice grew stronger as he spoke. "What I discovered is that I was the one who needed testing. My daughter saw through the lies I've been telling myself about business being separate from morality." He pulled a document from his jacket. "This is my resignation from Hale Industries, effective immediately. I'm also authorizing the dissolution of Eclipse Development and the transfer of all its assets to a community trust managed by Millgate residents." The room exploded into shocked conversation. Lena stared at her father, seeing him clearly for the first time, not as the distant businessman who'd raised her, but as someone capable of genuine courage and growth. "There's something else," Gideon said. "My wife set aside funds before she died specifically for repairing damage done by our business practices. Those funds are now available to this community." Tilda stood up, mixing skepticism with cautious hope. "That's pretty words, Mr. Hale. How do we know this isn't just corporate public relations?" "Because," Lena said, stepping back to the microphone, "I'm staying here to make sure it happens. I'm moving to Millgate to spend as long as it takes making sure every promise gets kept." The applause this time was warmer, more sustained. As Lena looked out at faces of people she'd come to care about, she felt something she'd been searching for without knowing it, purpose that had nothing to do with inherited wealth and everything to do with earned responsibility. Her father was watching her with something like pride mixed with amazement, as if seeing her clearly for the first time too. Whatever test he'd thought he was conducting, the results were nothing like what either of them had expected. The meeting continued with working groups formed and next steps outlined, but Lena knew the real work was just beginning. Rebuilding trust, like rebuilding a community, would take time and the kind of sustained commitment that couldn't be bought or engineered. As people filed out, buzzing with conversation and possibility, Lena found herself beside her father on the community center steps. The man who had been masquerading as a mechanic looked exhausted but somehow lighter. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly. "I'm still angry at you," she replied. "For the lies, for thinking you could manipulate love like a business transaction. But I'm also grateful. If you hadn't brought me here, I never would have understood what I was really inheriting." The truth, as her mother had written, was complicated and sometimes painful, but it was also the only foundation solid enough to build a future on. 3 months later, Millgate hummed with the sound of renewal. Scaffolding covered Main Street, where Eclipse Development's abandoned properties were being restored by local contractors hired with funds from Clarissa's remediation trust. The rhythmic hammering had become the town's heartbeat, punctuated by excited voices of people who'd forgotten what it felt like to plan for the future. Lena stood in what used to be Henderson's Five and Dime, watching a crew install windows that would soon frame the town's first computer learning center. The irony wasn't lost on her. Money originally extracted from Millgate was flowing back as fiber optic cables and refurbished laptops, transforming the space where Pete Henderson's grandfather once sold penny candy into a hub for digital literacy. Internet goes live next week. Noah called from across the room, testing computer stations he'd helped design. His wheelchair moved easily between workstations built to accommodate users of all abilities. Upload speeds faster than Columbus. The Learning Center had been Noah's idea, born from watching friends leave town because there were no local opportunities to develop technical skills. Now Millgate was about to become one of Ohio's most connected small towns. Mrs. Chen signed up for the first digital photography class. Noah grinned. Says she wants to document the recovery for her grandchildren in California. Lena smiled, thinking about the woman who'd been quietly feeding half the town while official development programs failed. Mrs. Chen understood that communities were built one relationship at a time, one shared meal and conversation at a time. Micah entered carrying coffee and the satisfied exhaustion that came from meaningful work. He'd been coordinating restoration projects while maintaining his diner shifts, serving as unofficial liaison between the community and the lawyers, turning promises into reality. Library's ready for reopening, he said, handing her a coffee mug reading Millgate Public Library, reopening October 15th. Mrs. Garrett's been cataloging for 12 hours straight. I think she's afraid someone will change their mind about funding. The library had been completed first, less physical renovation needed, and everyone understood its symbolic importance. Books that had sat in storage for months were back on shelves, joined by new acquisitions. The children's section had been expanded, computer terminals updated, and the meeting room equipped with presentation technology that would have impressed a city library twice the size. "How's your father adjusting?" Micah asked, settling into a chair salvaged from the old five and dime and refinished by local craftspeople. "Learning," Lena said, thinking about the man discovering what it meant to be accountable to community rather than shareholders. The transition from CEO to volunteer has been harder than expected. Gideon had kept his promise about resigning, though disentangling from the company he'd built proved legally complex. Corporate lawyers flew in and out of Columbus for weeks, negotiating asset transfers and subsidiary dissolutions while protecting Millgate's remediation trust from shareholder lawsuits. The personal transition had been even harder. A man who'd spent 20 years making decisions affecting thousands of employees was now learning drywall installation and trim painting, working alongside people whose trust he was still earning one honest conversation at a time. Yesterday he helped Mrs. Patterson organize inventory for the new general store, Lena continued. She says he's the most educated stock boy she's supervised. The general store was another rebuilding piece, providing basic necessities residents had been driving 20 miles to purchase. Mrs. Patterson managed it as a community-owned cooperative, with profits flowing into local improvements rather than corporate dividends. "Speaking of your father," Micah said, glancing outside, "isn't he helping with town square landscaping today?" Lena saw Gideon working with volunteers to plant trees around the newly renovated gazebo. He knelt in dirt beside Pete Henderson. Both men focused on establishing roots in soil neglected too long. The sight reminded her of something her mother had written. Redemption isn't given. It's earned one day at a time, one honest action at a time. "Town council meeting tonight," Micah said, checking his phone. "Final vote on the Development Oversight Committee." The Oversight Committee had been Tilda's idea, a 5-person board of local residents reviewing future development proposals to ensure they served community interests. It was structural change that would outlast current remediation efforts, creating long-term protection against future exploitation. "Nervous about the vote?" Lena asked. "Not about the committee passing. But Tilda's been hinting they want someone with financial expertise but no local political connections to chair it. Someone who's proven they'll put community interests ahead of personal profit." Lena felt her stomach tighten, realizing what he suggested. "They want me to chair it? You understand complex financial arrangements, and you've proven your priorities. Plus, having a Hale overseeing development accountability sends a strong message about preventing future exploitation." The idea was both flattering and terrifying. She'd been in Millgate 3 months. Long enough to love the community, but not long enough to fully understand local dynamics. Chairing oversight would mean staying permanently, committing to slow community building rather than the faster gratification of charitable check writing. "What do you think?" she asked. Micah considered carefully, characteristic of how they'd rebuilt trust after all secrets were revealed. Do whatever feels most authentic to who you want to become, he said finally. Not who you've been, not who others expect, but who you want to become. Before she could respond, Tilda entered carrying a folder that probably contained evening paperwork. She examined the nearly completed learning center with the expression of someone who'd watched decades of broken promises and was still adjusting to seeing them kept. Looking good, Tilda said, running her hand along a workstation. Noah's done excellent work ensuring accessibility. Thanks, Mrs. Avery, Noah called. Though I had help from people who understand community needs. About tonight's vote, Tilda said, facing Lena directly. We need to discuss what comes next for these projects. The conversation covered budgets, timelines, and practical challenges of sustaining development without ongoing outside funding. But underneath administrative details, Lena heard a deeper question. Was she prepared to commit her life to this place, to tie her future to slow, sustainable building rather than spectacular gestures? Late afternoon sun slanted through new windows, casting golden light across floors that would soon host people learning skills for better lives. Outside, construction sounds continued, the rhythm of renewal that had become Millgate's heartbeat. In that rhythm, Lena heard her mother's voice reminding her that love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect solutions. It was about showing up daily for people and places that mattered. It was choosing presence for the slow, imperfect work of improvement. The vote was hours away, but Lena knew her answer. She'd inherited money, privilege, and the burden of family mistakes. But she'd also inherited the opportunity to use those complicated gifts serving something larger than herself. That opportunity felt like the most valuable thing her parents had given her. Unlike money, it could only grow through use, becoming more precious the more freely it was shared. The safe deposit box had been waiting at First National Bank for 2 years, accumulating dust and legal complications while Clarissa Hale's estate cleared probate. Lena had forgotten its existence until Marcus called from Chicago with remaining assets requiring signatures. Most items were routine financial instruments, but this box was different, marked in her mother's handwriting, for Lena and Gideon to be opened together. 6 months after the town hall meeting, Lena sat in the bank's small vault room with her father, staring at metal that felt heavier than its size suggested. The manager had left them alone, understanding some conversations required privacy. She always liked dramatic timing, Gideon said quietly, tracing the box's edge. Remember Christmas mornings? She'd save the best presents for last, make us wait while she cleaned up wrapping paper first. Lena smiled at the memory. Their Christmases had been elaborate affairs with professionally decorated trees and enviable gifts, but her mother insisted on certain unbuyable rituals: homemade cookies, handwritten cards, presents that were meaningful rather than expensive. The last gift was always something personal, proving Clarissa had been paying attention to details that mattered most. Do you think she knew what would happen after she died? Lena asked. About the town, the experiment, all of it? Your mother was the smartest person I ever met. She understood people in ways I never learned, saw patterns I missed completely. If anyone could have predicted this, it was her. The box opened with a small click, revealing contents both surprising and inevitable. On top lay an envelope addressed to both in Clarissa's unmistakable script. Underneath, a small video camera, several unmarked DVDs, and a leather journal filled with handwritten notes. She made videos, Lena said, lifting a DVD labeled, For My Family, Watch Together. They started with the envelope, a letter longer than the others Lena had found, dated 2 weeks before Clarissa's death. My darling family. If you're reading this together, you've survived whatever complicated journey brought you here. I hope you've learned what I always knew. You're more alike than different, stronger together than apart. Gideon, you're going to spend years after I'm gone trying to control uncontrollable things. You'll make plans and conduct experiments because that's how your brilliant mind works. But love isn't a business problem to solve. It's a gift given freely, without conditions. Lena, you're going to spend those years figuring out who you are when you can't be who I was. You'll look for authenticity in places that seem different from everything you've known, thinking authenticity means rejecting privilege rather than taking responsibility for it. Both of you will learn that redemption can't be planned or controlled. It's earned through daily practice, showing up, telling truth, choosing love over fear. Watch these videos together, cry together, fight if needed. but don't let my death keep you apart. All my love, Mom. The first video showed Clarissa 6 months before death, still recognizable despite weight loss and cancer fatigue. She sat in her favorite chair wearing Gideon's favorite blue sweater, holding the coffee mug Lena had made in elementary school. Hello, my loves. I'm making these because I have things to tell you that might be hard to hear while I'm sick and you're scared. 40 minutes of the most honest conversation Lena had ever heard her mother have followed. Clarissa discussed her marriage to Gideon, how success had changed their relationship, her fears that Lena was growing up without understanding privilege's weight. She talked about love, responsibility, and the difference between protection and enablement. Lena, you'll have to figure out how to be rich without being selfish, how to use power without abusing it. That's the hardest thing wealthy people must learn, and most never manage it. But I think you can, because you have genuine curiosity about people different from you. She turned to Gideon, expression softening with 26 years of marital love. And you have to learn that being a good father isn't like being a successful CEO. You can't manage Lena's development like a quarterly report. Trust her to make mistakes, learn from them, become who she's meant to be. The second video was harder to watch. Clarissa's illness had progressed. Speaking required obvious effort, but her message remained clear. Take care of each other after she was gone. Honor her memory by building the relationship they'd never quite managed while she mediated their differences. The final video was hardest, recorded days before death when she clearly struggled with pain and medication but was determined to finish what she'd started. I'm going to die soon, and you'll both be angry. Angry at cancer, at each other, at me for leaving you to figure out family without the person who held you together. She paused for breath, and Lena saw Gideon's tears falling. But remember, love doesn't end when someone dies. It changes, deepens, becomes something you choose daily instead of take for granted. My love for you will outlive this broken body. It'll be there when you need to forgive each other, forgive yourselves, remember what matters. The video ended with Clarissa looking directly into camera, eyes holding all the love and wisdom that had defined her motherhood. Take care of each other. Take care of people who need you. Use what you have to build something beautiful. Remember, I'm proud of you both, always. The vault room felt impossibly quiet afterward. They sat processing 40 years of marriage and 26 years of parenting, compressed into 3 hours of recorded truth-telling. She knew exactly what would happen, Gideon said finally. The mistakes I'd make, how you'd react, all of it. She understood us better than we knew ourselves, Lena agreed. She knew we'd have to go through the lies, the experiment, the anger, the discovery, before we could have an honest relationship. The journal contained practical details, trust fund instructions, lawyer contacts, detailed notes about Millgate's history, and Eclipse Development's specific damages. Everything they'd discovered through investigation had been documented by Clarissa earlier, proof that her final gift was preparation as much as revelation. On the last page she'd written, redemption begins with seeing clearly, continues with acting courageously, succeeds through loving consistently. Walking out into late afternoon sunlight, Lena felt something settle that had been missing for years. Not just her relationship with her father, but continuity. Being part of something larger than individual choices. Her mother's love was the constant that made everything possible. And she understood that love was also her inheritance, not just to receive, but to pass on. I want to show these videos to Micah, to Noah, to people who've been part of rebuilding, she said. Mom would have wanted them to understand where this came from. She believed in community, Gideon agreed. She would have loved seeing what we've accomplished here. They walked down Main Street, past the reopened library, restored storefronts, and construction sites for new businesses. The town looked and felt completely different. Energy in the air, collective optimism from people working toward shared goals. That evening, after sharing Clarissa's videos with friends who'd become family, Lena walked alone through quiet streets of her adopted hometown. The air was winter crisp. Stars visible as they never were in Chicago. She heard construction equipment being stored. Distant laughter from Pete Henderson's farm where volunteers planned tomorrow's landscaping. The gentle hum of a community learning to trust its own future. Her mother's voice was clear in memory. Love was a choice made new every day. Looking around at the town that had taught her the difference between having money and creating value, Lena felt ready to make that choice for life. Redemption wasn't a destination but a direction, chosen one honest step at a time. 1 year later, the autumn air in Millgate carried the scent of apple cider and fresh-cut lumber. The community fair stretched across what had once been the abandoned chemical dump, now transformed into rolling green space dotted with picnic tables and a playground where children's laughter echoed off the surrounding hills. Lena stood beside the memorial garden, watching Noah demonstrate his latest creation, an AI-powered wheelchair that responded to voice commands and could navigate rough terrain with the grace of a dancer. A crowd of fascinated onlookers peppered him with questions, while his brother Micah beamed with pride nearby. "Hard to believe this used to be a contaminated wasteland," said Mrs. Chen, joining Lena at the memorial plaque that bore Clarissa's name in elegant bronze lettering. "Your mother would be proud of what you've built here." The transformation hadn't been quick or easy. Environmental remediation had taken months, followed by careful soil restoration and landscaping that involved half the town in weekend volunteer sessions. But the result was something none of them had imagined when they'd first discovered the buried contamination, a space that honored the past while nurturing the future. Gideon approached carrying 2 cups of coffee from the booth run by the recently reopened Main Street Cafe. At 64, he moved with the careful precision of someone whose hands had learned the difference between building and destroying. His work clothes were genuinely worn now, stained with honest labor rather than costume. "The Development Oversight Committee just approved 3 new business proposals," he said, settling beside them on the bench they'd installed in Clarissa's memory. "All local entrepreneurs, all committed to community ownership models." Lena smiled, thinking about the monthly committee meetings where she'd learned to balance financial expertise with community wisdom. The work was sometimes frustrating. Small-town politics moved slowly, and consensus building required patience she was still developing. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways her old life had never been. "Speaking of new developments," Micah said, approaching with Noah rolling alongside him, "we have an announcement." Lena looked up to see both brothers grinning with a kind of excitement that suggested important news. "The podcast?" she guessed. "Small Town, Big Truths just got picked up for national syndication," Noah announced, his voice carrying across the garden. 20 markets to start, with options for more if the audience responds well. The podcast had been Lena's idea, a way to document not just Millgate's recovery, but the broader patterns of corporate extraction and community resilience they'd discovered. What started as local storytelling had evolved into investigative journalism that was helping other small towns recognize and fight similar exploitation. "That's incredible," Mrs. Chen said, clapping her hands together. "Clarissa always said the best way to honor truth was to share it widely." As the afternoon wore on, Lena found herself moving through the fair with the easy familiarity of someone who truly belonged. She helped Pete Henderson judge the pie contest, listened to Tilda Avery's plans for expanding the library's digital literacy programs, and watched her father teach a group of teenagers how to properly use power tools for the community workshop he'd helped establish. When evening fell and the last families were packing up their picnic blankets, Lena stood with Micah at the edge of the memorial garden. The lights of Main Street twinkled below them, no longer the hollow glow of empty storefronts, but the warm illumination of businesses that employed local people and served community needs. "Any regrets?" Micah asked, taking her hand as they watched the town settle into peaceful darkness. Lena thought about her old life, the penthouse apartment, the charity galas, the comfortable distance that wealth had provided from the consequences of her family's choices. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, searching for authenticity in all the wrong places, while the real work of redemption waited in her own inheritance. "None," she said, meaning it completely. "This is exactly where I belong." Above them, stars appeared one by one in the clear Ohio sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, budget meetings and development proposals, and the endless, necessary work of building community. But tonight, surrounded by people who taught her the difference between having money and creating worth, Lena felt the deep satisfaction that came from choosing love over fear, truth over comfort, presence over perfection. Her mother had been right about everything that mattered most. You didn't get to choose what you inherited, but you did choose what you passed on. And in Millgate, under a canopy of stars that had watched generations of families build and rebuild their lives, that choice felt like the most precious gift of all. The story of the Millionaire CEO and his daughter had ended. The story of the community they'd learned to love was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.